confirm quickly that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So looks like we're live.
Mhm.
So, okay. So this is episode 21, if I haven't made any mistakes in counting. Welcome, everyone. And yeah, so before we start, actually, I'll have to justify why episodes have been dropping a little, but I've been really busy with a lot of stuff outside of internet, which is why I've had the opportunity to meet Martijn, actually, because I was busy doing stuff. So yes, we've had some delays in the calendar, but that has brought really cool opportunities as well. So tonight's guest is Martijn Wijnhoven, Dutch archaeologist, but currently working in the Czech Republic in Brno. So, Martijn, if you want to introduce yourself, you'll probably do a better job than I could.
I don't know. I think you already made a great start there. Yeah, you already presented my name. I work currently in the Czech Republic, and this is a full mouth, I always say, in the Institute of Archaeology of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Brno. And there I am a researcher. And if people know me on your channel, they probably know me because of my research into military equipment, and especially military equipment in antiquity. And I'm especially passionate about body armor. So they probably know me from that then.
Yes. So, as I was mentioning, I met Martijn at a symposium in Ljubljana on mail, which is, when we think about the sword community being niche, then there's mail, which is the even more niche environment, but still super, super interesting. So actually, then I think maybe before we get into mail and things, first, how did you become, how did your road lead you to becoming an archaeologist?
Well, that's a pretty easy one. My parents always stimulated me to go to museums and things. And if you want a true story, I, as a child, was taken to a library at 5 years old by the school. And I didn't want to look at the books for children. So I went into what I thought was the adult section. It's probably adolescent section. And I saw first a book on dinosaurs. And with those dinosaurs, I remember one picture of a skull and the entrance of the nerves and the back ends going into the skull. And I thought it was really cool. And a couple of days later, I was playing outside with friends, and I discovered a dinosaur, or at least that is what I thought I discovered. Then the cranium we got, and we said, no, it must be a wolf. And I took it to my parents, and my father told me it's probably a poodle. But and there was the seed for the interest in archaeology. And then I was stimulated by people surrounding me, my aunts, my parents, my friends. I started collecting all over. And for example, if I would find a dead animal, I would take it home, bury it in the garden, and then dig it up. Oh, poor parents, I would say so. And then slowly I got more and more into archaeology. And when I was in high school, it was very obvious. For some people, it was difficult to make a choice what they wanted to do in their lives. And for me, it was obviously archaeology. Yeah.
Cool. So you didn't go via the Indiana Jones and then the disappointment of.
No.
Okay, cool.
No, it wasn't Indiana Jones that inspired me. It was actually books for older children.
Yeah. But you risked being a paleontologist then. That was also in the.
That was absolutely in the stars for me. But I discovered around the age of 10, more or less, that was difficult to study in the Netherlands. And that coincided with an aunt of mine that did a lot of trips, adventurous trips all over the world. And she went to Mexico. And she had photographs of Mexico shown me after her trip. And I thought, yeah, I want to do Mexican archaeology. So I got into Mexican archaeology originally.
Okay. And then the transition then to arms and armor, and how
Came,
did that
came in
come to be?
Mexico actually, and this is this is because of a friend called Cesar, and I was at the time living with him and some family members in an apartment, and we had this really great relationship of having good talks at nights that could continue and continue and continue. And he was an industrial designer, and we were talking about, this mill in Spanish, cota de malla, is
Mhm.
probably almost the same in
It's
Italian,
exactly the same, yes.
or the maglia, I think, in Italian. And we were having this late night, and I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And he told me, if you want to know more about this stuff, why don't you make one and see how that plays out? And these were the early days of the internet. So I went onto the internet, and there were actually some pages that more or less explained it. So I tried to figure it out, and I loved making stuff with my hands, but I even like doing research more. So I wanted to know more and more and more. And there came a point in time in which I said, I probably know enough that I can do a small publication or something like that. And that eased me into the arms and armor section.
Okay. So it already started with mail, and then it developed to the other aspects of
Yeah. It just started with one silly conversation at night, wanting to know how this was worn, used, etc. And then from mail, it evolved into, I would say, especially archaeology of antiquity.
Mhm.
I always liked within archaeology, and I know I'm going to scare away some people, but I love that it is a bit further away, the Roman time periods, because there's much more to discover
Mhm.
than a time period that is closer. So when it comes to the study of mail, for example, I get more excited by very early examples because I feel there's so much more to discover yet than, for
Mhm.
example, a 16th century one. Although a 16th century one can be very interesting in its own right, but it doesn't give me the same excitement of doing research on it. Yeah.
I see. So in the meantime, I'll just remind everyone who's watching that you're free to ask questions in the comments. There's no like format or anything. There will be some time at the end only for questions if you have any, but if something interests you while we talk, feel free to comment. So when you say that your interest goes as back in time, let's say, as possible in terms of mail, does that apply to all of your research? Like the older something is for you, the more it's interesting, or is that specific to mail?
No, I think for me the sweet spot is that it needs to be a subject that hasn't been studied by many people, where
Hmm.
there's still a lot of ground to cover, but that has the ability, there is still the potency of having enough sources to make sense of it. So my wife is also an archaeologist. She studies the Paleolithic times,
Hmm.
so way farther back. And for her, the Roman period is a bit boring. She says, you already know everything. And for me, Paleolithic times are interesting, but very frustrating because you
Hmm.
don't know almost nothing. And
Yeah.
for me, the sweet spot is, I would say, in antiquity. There's still a lot to discover, a lot to do, but there's also a lot of source material just lying there that we can use. So I
True.
would say that is what interests me. Yeah.
Okay. And so, in terms of arms and armor, what has your experience been? Like, okay, mail is obviously a big part of your interest, but what else has been at the center of your research or studies?
I so I don't know why, but the defensive part of military equipment attracts me more than the offensive part. I don't
Hmm.
know why. This could be a Freudian thing or whatever, but but everything defensive I find very interesting, and especially when it hasn't received a lot of love. So this was the case when I started researching mail armor. I found out, yes, there has been some publications, people have been looking at this, but there's still so much to discover. And the same thing I find now on my current research. I'm looking into Roman scale armor. It's the same. Everyone is familiar with Roman scale armor, but having simple questions like, when was this introduced in the Romans? When did it fade out? How was it made? What type of undergarment did they use? Very basic questions. Nobody knows. And I would say the evidence is there. The only thing that one needs to do is do a systematic study of all that evidence and connect the dots.
So there's already enough in terms of actual material finds to be able to do that study, you think?
I would say so. As an archaeologist, of course, I hope to have many future finds, etc. But even if we consider that there's no future finds at all, we're talking about many big collections of scale armor being present in archaeological depots or in museums. Some museums have a couple of scales, but many museums have a lot. One of the examples in my current study, I'm working together with the Kulturfabrik in Carnuntum. This is where all the material from that part of the Roman world has been stored. And we're talking about hundreds of finds. And some finds contain one scale and other finds contain hundreds of scales. And the same goes with the Yale University Art Gallery. I had a research visit there, and I was able to go over all the material they have from Dura Europos in Syria. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about hundreds, hundreds of finds. So, and once what I've seen is that many studies so far use a lot of anecdotal evidence. So there's a few stars that are known, they are always mentioned, but a more systematic approach of what is out there, the evidence, and what does the complete picture tell us. And of course, that takes a lot of work, but that is what very much interests me. And I think a lot is to be gained. Yeah.
Interesting. So we're waiting for the next book on scale armor, I suppose.
If all goes well,
Nice.
famous words. It should be, the manuscript should be finished by the end of 2026.
Okay, cool.
Will be published soon after. Yeah.
And from archaeologist perspective, is there a lot of material that is in that gray area of lacking archaeological provenance when it comes to Roman armor, for example?
Yep.
And
no, that's absolutely right. So we're working with material that is either found in an archaeological context that has been registered, which for us archaeologists is the best, because it will render us much more clues than only the objects. The context is very valuable, as you know. Then I would say there are other areas. So we have a lot of metal detectorists all over Europe and beyond. Some countries have established a very good working relationship with them. In other countries, it's prohibited. In the Czech Republic, there is a good working relationship with a lot of metal detectorists that report their finds, and so we know the location, etc. But we're also dealing with a lot of detector finds outside of the Czech Republic, or some of them inside the Czech Republic, in which we don't have any clue. And then there's, of course, also the old excavations that took place in the 19th century, 20th century, prior to the Second World War, where the manner in which was being excavated and how things were recorded at the time were different. So there are a lot of archaeological artifacts that have been excavated a long time ago, but that we say, yeah, it comes from this site, and that is basically what we know. Yeah.
And thinking of the origin of the different, let's say, levels of material remains, is there a point when the object becomes useless to the archaeologist, or can you always find, even in, let's say, something that was confiscated on the black market, for instance, even that can have some use for you?
It can always have use. I mean, there's no archaeological artifact that is useless. But some of them render a wealth of information, and others, let's say an object was taken from the black markets, confiscated, and we only know the object itself. The object can still be studied in many ways. Traditional, by just looking at it, describing what you're seeing, but it can also be scientifically analyzed. We can look at the material composition, and maybe that can give us clues of its origin or of its date. So there are many other things that we can still do. What happens if you have more finds without a context? You need to work much harder to get good and solid information. And if you still have that archaeological context, it is easy going, because you can make easier interpretations. What is this? Why is this? Why was this deposited? And it's much more valuable. But now, please, all archaeological information is valuable. As such, as in science, I say, even if you're excavating somewhere and you find absolutely nothing, no structures, no human activity, no artifacts, that is still valuable archaeological information. It's not very exciting, but it is valuable information.
True.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, I was trying to think, because I can imagine that when it comes to like Roman or antique, like from pieces of arms and armor from antiquity, the majority will be archaeological, of course, finds. Whereas if I think about like modern era swords, so what usually is the center of most collectors' accessibility to swords, there lots of times the information, there's no archaeological information, of course, because they're not excavated from anywhere, but there's also often very little information in terms of probably like it just came through some other collection. So there's a bit of a sad situation where a lot of these objects, you can kind of, recognize them and say this is this, but then you're kind of stuck with that.
I think even with that time frame, we have a similar situation in which you will have objects that have a certain historical provenance, let's say, in which so it was never excavated, but it was made somewhere. It went from this owner to that place, to that place, to that place. And that will hold valuable information. You have other objects that owned another person, anonymous, and now you own it, and so the history of the object is kind of lost. And then again, you still have the value of the artifact itself and the possibility with more scientific methods to discover more about the object, but it's harder.
Yeah, definitely. So if we talk about then your field of your main expertise, let's say, so defense from antiquity or Roman period especially, what would kind of, if you had to give the brief history of where the style origins from, or why they started using mail, or how that came into Rome, and main developments?
So mail armor, and maybe I think all your viewers know that with mail, I mean chain mail, but chain mail has its problems as a term, but we mean the same with this. So ringed armor was invented in the late Iron Age. So it was not a Roman invention. And in my research, I try to look at the origin of mail armor. And there have been several ideas prior to my research being proposed. And some of them I could disprove, One of them was, for example, that many times the Scythians were mentioned as being early inventors of mail armor, with mail armor finds possibly from the 5th to even sometimes 6th century BC. And what happens there is that you see sometimes in the study of things, the way how things are translated matter. And while the original Russian sources speak of mail armor, of scale armor, they were translated as mail armor. So I could disprove that part of the Scythians being the origins. And looking at the earliest finds, what we see is the earliest evidence is from around the turn of the 4th to the 3rd century BC. And it's all from a Latin, so Celtic context. Yeah. And we're pretty sure that the Celts were responsible for the invention of mail armor. We cannot pinpoint this to any specific place in Europe. What you see is at that time, it's a very much a luxury product for the warrior elites. And that warrior elite has big networks that go all over Europe. So once it appears everywhere. In small quantities, but it appears everywhere. So in the first 50 years of the invention of mail, what we see it from England to Bulgaria, for example, and it's all like one big explosion amongst the elites. It's difficult to go into Republican Roman armor. There are not a lot of finds of them, and one of the reasons has to do with the customs of the Romans of not burying the dead oftentimes with all the weaponry, etc. So that is kind of obscure, but we have several. We have written sources mentioning it. Polybius, for example, in the 2nd century BC already. We have some depictions from the 2nd century BC. And we also have some finds that point to a similar date. So I would say somewhere along the lines of the 3rd to the 2nd century BC, the Romans adopted this type of armor. And one of the big differences is while within the Celtic society, mail served as one of those luxury items belonging only to the warrior elites, this very much changed when the Romans became involved. We're starting to see mass production, and that mass production is ramped up enormously when we start to see the empire. So let's say under the reign of Augustus, this starts to ramp up. And we're talking about a situation in which the late Iron Age in Celtic societies, we would have one or several people, the highest status, wearing mail, towards having an entire army using mail. So the inspiration came from the Celts, but the application on, I would say, almost an industrial level is absolutely contributed to the Romans.
Okay, so a lot of really interesting things, I think, to spark a conversation. One is actually, this is, I have to confess, mail and is really not something I started learning about it in Ljubljana with you guys. But
sorry.
No, it's really cool. Very interesting.
I hope you have the mail back now.
Yes. So one of the, I think, very interesting things is that I think a lot of people, when superficially looking at armor, look at mail as a more crude form of mail until plate armor comes, and then that's like the peak of. But one thing that emerged during these talks was how, let's say, there's a kind of hard limit to how efficiently you can produce mail. So it always stays a relatively high cost object compared to, let's say, plate, which at some point can be semi-industrialized. So my question is, how do you think the Romans were able to mass produce it? Was it only an issue, like, were they able to, or do we have information on whether they were able to find efficiencies in production, or was it just a matter of volume and thus kind of economies of scale?
It's the latter.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we do not have manuals how it was made or whatever. So this is in the head of the craftsman working at the time. But what we do know is that almost every soldier was armored, and was armored with something. Not every soldier, but almost every soldier. And we're talking about time periods in which we could have not 50,000 people, but let's say under Trajan, if I'm not mistaken, we're talking about an estimate guess of about 350,000 soldiers at the same time being equipped in armor. That is no longer a craftsman working in his backyard in a shed making this. We're talking about massive production. And we do have some written sources that give some clues. Some speak, especially in late antiquity, of state factories and even dedicated state factories. And for earlier years, during the Principates, there's clues that we have, for example, papyri from Egypt that tell us that people needed to, if you're a soldier at the frontier, you do not only do the soldiering, you also have duties in the fabrica, in the factory. What they did in the factory, it isn't stated. But we do know there were duties being done there. And it does make a lot of sense to at least keep your soldiers also busy in the recycling, in the repair, and possibly also in the manufacture of this. Mm-hmm. This is also a way to keep costs relatively low. And then we have simply the amount of evidence. So we have mountains of evidence compared to the period before and after. And we, of course, we need to think about how does an artifact end up in the archaeological records? Because it's not what we find nowadays does not need to be representative of what was being used out there. But the sheer quantity of Roman military equipment that we find shows us that this is not a product for the most elites. But what we see, for example, once the Romans decide to leave a certain fort, they will dismantle it. And all the material that they have, that they usually use for repair, for recycling, a decision is made, are we carrying this back or are we burying this? And the reason for the burying is because you don't want the enemy to have all that rich material. So usually they would dismantle a fort and bury everything that they don't want to take with them. And that is oftentimes a lot of weaponry, armor, almost always damaged and is in a state of disrepair. But the scale in which we find this does point to a much more industrial scale of armor and weapons being used.
Yeah, and going back just a second to the Celtic production, because of course, Rome has this industrial scale, but when I think it's really interesting sometimes when we look at earlier civilizations, or sometimes it can go really back, and you have these international trade networks, and you see that there was one case with swords is the Uthbert swords. Well, it's not; it's post-Roman, but still, you see this kind of just international network. And in terms of finds of mail, can these help us build a story of these trade networks? Like, is there enough Celtic finds that we can kind of trace the path of these pieces of mail, or is it just we see them all over Europe, but we don't know much more?
Currently, we see them all over Europe, and we're talking the first 100 years. We're talking about maybe 30 finds, but that increases through the last 3 centuries. But when it comes to using that as a tool to see how the networks were developing and the nature of it is a good idea, but I would never only focus on mail armor. Mail armor is just one of the material categories that can inform us about these networks. And of course, there's other disciplines. I think genetics can play a very interesting role in these networks and long-range networks in these areas and times. So I think more in a holistic way approach. And then mail can be, I would not say a footnote, but a paragraph supporting or contradicting that story. Yeah.
Okay. And before we go back to the Roman mail, is all this mail we're talking about riveted always? Is that the standard, or is the butted mail, does it have a place, even though it's...
It's one I remember me getting onto the internet when I was just into this subject and being overwhelmed how many people have opinions on this. But I did in my research look at this. So the previous thoughts that we saw a lot is the idea of an evolution from simple to complex. So many people would say, so the earliest mail is not riveted, and for people that are not informed, these rings are made of small pieces of wire. These wires are overlapped. The overlap is flattened, a hole is pierced, and a rivet is placed, so the ring cannot open easily. So the idea oftentimes presented in research was not. It must have evolved from simple to complex. And there were two specific finds, but I would say especially a find from Romania that is fairly early, from Siomesti. And I know I'm butchering this name. Sorry, Romanian colleagues. But from Siomesti. And that was clearly butted. We have very nice pictures. I had the possibility to study it in person a couple of years ago, and it's absolutely butted. And that was the argument. Okay, it must be from butted towards riveted. When I started systematically looking at the evidence, especially the earliest evidence, we see from the moment it's invented, riveted rings are being present. And now we come to this conundrum. How do we explain why would you go from something that is super riveted towards a product that is probably inferior? These butted rings can be opened with very little force. And what I saw was that butted rings do occur. They occur under specific conditions. We see them especially as repair rings. So a coat of mail riveted, and you will find several butted rings because it's an easy repair and it's fine enough. We find them also a lot as decoration if you want to use a different type of material, like a brass or some type of copper alloy. And we find oftentimes that these can be. Or we find them in repair patches. So that still leaves us with this famous find from Romania that is butted and fairly early. And my interpretation is that we need to stay away from very simplistic modern thinking of things go from simple to complex. Usually, if we have a new technology, cell phones is a great example. You have an explosion of different types, and then you have one or two that survive. So it's not so much linear; it's more like a Christmas tree almost. And my interpretation is that from the very beginning, this was a functional piece of armor, and we see this in being riveted. And the explanation of this Romanian find has to do with it's a very early period in time. There's only a few craftsmen that can actually produce riveted rings. And it's obviously in this network a status symbol. It's a very powerful symbol of your position. And what do you get? You get what I interpret as knockoffs, as a very cool imitation. It shouts, I also have one. But the owner of the tomb at least didn't have access to craftsmen that
Yeah.
had the knowledge to do the riveting. Is that important? No, probably not, because it's not about protection there. It's all about the image that you're conveying. And once you see that this technology becomes available to more and more craftsmen, that is also the ending of this knockoff, or what I call the knockoff brands, and you see everything being riveted.
It sounds very plausible for sure.
It's the best explanation I could see in the evidence.
Yeah.
And then again, it reverses. So at the end of the life cycle of mail armor that is still being used in from the 17th, 18th, even 19th century, for example, in India, we see them going back from riveted to butted because it's no longer about the protection and it's all about the perception of the item. So the riveting is just redundant.
So that small rivet has a crucial effect on the defensive capability of mail.
Absolutely.
I think that would surprise most people who haven't thought about it, because
No, one thing is, and butted links can be very strong if they're very heavy. But in armor, and I would say in the study of violence in general, there's always an equilibrium in between factors. So I can have a lot of protection. So let's say I make my butted links very thick, so they absolutely do not pry open. But then I'm moving around in maybe 20, 25 kilograms of armor. That will slow me down, will get me more tired. So in this equilibrium, you want to have the maximum amount of protection, the maximum amount of mobility, and at the same time, the minimum of weight. And this is so if you can reduce the weight by half just by having that small rivet there and having the same protection, that is very, very attractive.
Yeah, I can see that. And another thing that I think is really interesting when looking at mail, let's say for the first time or close up for the first time, is when you talk about striking a balance between, let's say, usability and practicality versus is how tailored these pieces are, at least when we're talking for the Middle Ages. It's really shocking. So if any of you have the chance and haven't done that so far, really go up close if you see mail, because the diameter of the rings changes, the lines of tailoring are almost like clothing, and that has palpable impact on the way it drapes on you. Do we see this kind of tailoring also for Roman mail, or is it kind of more of a standard?
So I in my research started with what I knew, and what I knew well was late medieval, early modern European mail codes. And as you say, there's many different techniques using different gauges of thickness of rings, or using different sizes, and then just like knitting, adding rings or adding rows, so expanding, contracting. That was my start. So I said, I know this is being done in this, what I call historical mail. So mail that survived not through the archaeological record, but by being handed down from person to person. So I said, okay, this is my starting point, and I will try to see if the evidence for the Roman period will support this. And my expectation was, obviously, it will have this. And to my big surprise, the evidence is very, very limited for this. Then I came to the realization that you cannot look at an artifact in isolation of the culture that produces it. Mm-hmm. So what we know from the Roman period, that mail was being considered as a tunic. And it's actually tailored exactly the same as a Roman tunic, just made of iron rings. And you see the introduction of this expanding and contraction in mail armor goes exactly hand in hand with changes in textile civilian clothing, in which in the late Middle Ages we get all these Gothic and sharp shapes and things that are with a lot of volume, then very contracted. So there is, of course, in part the capability of a mail maker to apply these methods, the client wanting them, but also the cultural conception at that specific time. How do you perceive what this artifact, what this object is? And if a Roman mail maker would think of it as a tunic, albeit made of iron, they would make it in the shape of a tunic. And if the late medieval craftsman thinks of it more like a medieval shirt, late medieval, that has tailoring, the same tailoring being reflected. And I'm pretty sure that Roman craftsmen, because we do have some indications that they know how to limit the amount of rows, so they do know, but they almost don't apply it.
That's fascinating, I think, because I think the automatic where you would go to thinking, just hypothesizing, would be, oh yeah, okay, industrially produced, it's probably just very simple, but you're expressing more of it's a connection to perception of what the object is, let's say, which is very, very interesting, I think.
So I, in my backgrounds of Mexican archaeology, there's also a lot of anthropology, and this is the anthropological part, I would say, in which you cannot separate the mind of the maker from the society that they are part of. And that society will always influence, whether it be conscious or subconscious, will influence decisions that they make. And untying this a little bit is, and it's something I really like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as we know, is mail invented, or our first understanding of where it pops out, at least as far as we can know, is in the Celtic environments. But is this one of those things where we see like independent development across the world, or so as far as we know, that's the place where it was born?
No, as far as we know, that is the place where it was born, and then it got transported towards other areas. But that is where we see the earliest evidence. Of course, mail and the invention of mail also stands on the shoulders of giants, of course. And that means there's already during the Iron Age, during the early Iron Age, and during the late Bronze Age, people are figuring things out with rings that interconnect, whether it be for something decorative or something else, but people are experimenting. And so also mail armor is not an invention that can be seen completely loose from that. And we see a lot of evidence, actually, in Italy, especially if you go to any museum that has late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, you will find a lot of copper rings being interconnected, etc. It actually looks a lot like mail, but was not used as such. It was absolutely not armor.
And well, in the meantime, hello, Marco. So Marco Faccio joined. He's another one of the of the mail community names. So yeah, welcome, and feel free to join in the conversation. Is there any unique characteristic quality of iron that made it perfect for the birth of mail compared to, let's say, a copper alloy or bronze? Like from a metallurgical perspective, or even from a crafting perspective, are they different enough that we can say, oh, iron was the catalyst for it?
Well, we know that iron was being used as the primary material from its invention until recent times. We do find sometimes other metals being used, but those are usually decorative. There's a handful of exceptions, but it's usually iron. I think one of the crucial things is you need to be able to make a lot of iron wire in order to make a mill shirt. And I think we have earlier evidence for the drawing of wire when it comes to gold, to copper. But I actually think that the invention of mill goes hand in hand with the ability of wire drawing of iron, which is usually considered a little bit more difficult because it's harder than drawing, for example, a bronze or a gold wire. I think that has been crucial, and what we see that most of the analysis, and there hasn't been a lot of analysis when it comes to mill rings, especially not those early rings, but those that have been done show that usually we're talking about a very pure iron with not a lot of slag. And that is, of course, something you want when it comes to the drawing of iron.
Makes sense. And in terms of the like the weaving pattern, no, it's not weaving, but let's say
I always call it just weaving, but
perfect.
Yeah, call it whatever you like.
Yeah. Do we see big changes, let's say, from the early Celtic versions to what we see, let's say, in the Middle Ages, or have these patterns just were they optimized already in the the Iron Age, and then we didn't really change?
So once, if you like to make mail for yourself and you go onto the internet, you will be hit with many different patterns. So it gives you a lot of possibilities. And of course, the interconnection of rings, you can make jewelry out, and all of these have names. So one would think that there was a lot of variety. The archaeological evidence shows the opposites. We see in the early Iron Age some experimentation, but it starts with what is called a classic 4-in-1 pattern. It makes rows of rings, and every ring connects to 2 rings in the row above and 2 rings in the row below. And this mesh also has a direction. So in one direction, it can be stretched more than in the other direction. And once we see this, and we see this from the start, it's until the demise of mail that is the dominant pattern. And the reason, I think, is because this pattern allows a good protection. And one of the key features is what I just said: it can stretch in one direction more than into the other direction. And mail is always warned that the rows go horizontal, the rings of rows. And that means that if you sit down and your belly pops up, it will just move with your body. So the weave will open a little bit more and close again. And I think that is such a good characteristic of mail armor, which is not present in many of the other weaves, in which there is no stretch. And that stretch is, I would say, essential for the utility. Let's say you're walking around, you're bending over, you're horseback riding, all these activity, you want mobility. And this weave gives you mobility without it being too heavy.
Okay, so yes, so it's almost as if maybe not born perfect, but it was already from the early stages. We kind of had reached its apex in a sense.
And the only exception, I would say, we have a lot of variety of of ring patterns being used in Japan. But in Japan, mail was introduced there through contact, and it was never used as in the West. It was never used as a standalone armor. It was always combined with textiles and with other stuff. So you get a sort of a hybrid armor in which this mail weave has an additional function. And there you see a lot of very interesting patterns, but it's being used in quite a different manner.
Yeah. And do you think these different patterns have specific functions, or are they even just aesthetic in this case? Like once you don't have that stretchability of the 4-in-1, is
You
it
know
just a
what,
matter of?
Gabriel? It's good to know what you know, and it's good when you don't
Yeah,
know.
true.
I have no idea. We should ask a Japanese expert. I
True,
think
true,
there's
true.
people that are better in answering this question than I am. I'm
Makes
sorry.
sense. No, it would be shocking if there was an answer to everything.
That's true. That's true.
Um, One thing you were talking about earlier was this kind of process of either repair or creation on the edge, on the fringes of the Roman Empire, let's say.
Yeah.
And this was one of the things you talked about in your
Yeah.
presentation in Ljubljana, which was really interesting because I think it's interesting because of the mail itself, but also it helps bring to life places and events that otherwise, like it's like a piece of metal that tells all this richer story. So
Mhm.
maybe do you want to tell us a little about the hoard you studied and like its context and what it told you?
Oh, absolutely. So this is a finds from Bonn in Germany. And this is research that I haven't done alone, but I've done this together with Claudia Kopman and with Holger Becker. Um, and with them together, we studied the remains of what we call a hoard of 14 kilos in total. So it's quite a lot of mail armor that was found in the vicus. And a vicus is the civilian settlement next to a Roman fort. And of course, first we wanted to understand the mill itself. So we did several things. On the one hand, we started just examining it, taking photograph measurements, describing it. But I had the fortune that Holger already had a CT scan, a very powerful CT scan, not the one you have in a hospital, being made in which we were able to see inside of the mail bundle. Because as an archaeological artifact, it's a big ball and everything is corroded together and you cannot unfold it. So you cannot see what is inside. And we were able to see different sizes of rings. And we were able to determine then that this block was not one coat of mail, it was actually two complete or almost complete coats of mail, a fairly large section of one and a small section of another one. And then came, of course, the question, what is this doing, being buried in a pit next to a house in a civilian settlement next to a Roman fort? And the idea that we have, or the interpretation that we do of this finds, is that not only the soldiers were involved, but also, I would say, next to such a fort would dictate the local economy. So it would attract many people as well. So you get a local economy of people working for the Roman army. And in this case, we say, okay, the recycling of mail armor, and if you've looked at mail armor from late medieval times or early modern times, and you take a good look at it, you will see repair patches everywhere. So the best way to recycle mail is not trying to remelt it, which is not easy, but the best way is just to cut out the best parts and cannibalize that in order to repair other parts. So we said the best interpretation that we can give is of the material. What is that doing there next to a Roman fort? It's probably repair activities taking place there by civilians. Then why did they leave this? I already told you, once a Roman army decides to leave a fort, they will usually not leave it like this. They will dismantle it. And even all the surplus material that they don't carry around, they will leave. In Bonn, we see at the same time that the Roman fort is being dismantled. This is about the mid-3rd century. The economy of the vicus, of the civilian place, is gone. Once the military is gone, there is no economy there. So we see exactly the same dismantling of those parts of the vicus. And probably a decision, is this still worth something? Is this worth carrying around? And the answer was clearly no. And they buried it in a pit next to the house, so it could not be taken by other people, but never with the intent of coming back and recovering it as the traditional hoard.
Yeah. I think we have a question by Marco that I think you already kind of addressed, but we'll get to it in a moment. But I think that it's just fascinating when you see the pictures of this hoard is you can see the person wrapping it up and rolling it up. It's like this nice bundle. It just makes it so real and alive that that's really fascinating. So Marco asks, in many late medieval pieces, we find subsequent alterations or repairs, some with older rings, some newer. Has an ancient artifact with similar recognizable characteristics ever been found?
Yes. Yeah, we see the same. So people recycle, and the best way of recycling mail is the reuse of it. So absolutely. And the challenge, of course, for archaeological artifacts is that once you're used to the more historical specimens, which can still be wielded, in which the mesh is flexible, excuse me, that is far easier to study than oftentimes the archaeological evidence, which in exceptional cases, we have such a find, for example, from Denmark, Wijnhoven. It's still flexible, but usually it's not flexible. Usually it's just one big bundle, and if it's very highly corroded, you can see ring shapes, and it's not always easy to recognize this. So the chances of finding these repair patches are lower in archaeological specimens. But the ones that are well preserved do show evidence of repair. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Yes. And kind of this actually opens the door to another topic, which is technological advancements in research. And I know you've or are currently applying like different methods, and let's say you're using technology to your advantage, let's say. So in terms of maybe specifically to mail, but then we can even move just to hoplology in general, and what is currently the landscape in terms of technological advances that could really help us break through with our understanding of remains?
So I think one of the interesting things is that we had a CT scan of the Bonn remains. So we have this 14-kilo bundle, and we can go through it, and we see rings, but the human mind is not able to make an interpretation of this. It's just too complicated to remember all these different layers with all these ring connections. The idea always has been with these scans, it would be lovely if we can unfold it digitally and see what item is actually being represented and which parts of the item survive. Currently, that is impossible, but I think with AI and the development that we're seeing, we're very close to the application in which we do have such CT scans. And with AI, I'm sure it is able to unfold this into a garment. So that is something I'm very excited about. And another thing that I'm very excited about is more the experimental parts. It's something that I have been research that I've been doing together with Alexei Moskvin and his wife, Maria, in which we use very accurate digital reconstructions And this is actually something that comes more from the fashion industry. You can make very good digital twins and examine them under certain circumstances. So within archaeology, we have the realm of experimental archaeology. And usually that entails also some type of reconstruction in order to learn how things were done or whether, but that's an actual physical object. And that takes, it's, to be honest, it's loads of fun to do. I love experimental archaeology, but it takes resources, energy, and sometimes you don't have these. And I would not say that digital experimentation can replace the physical one, but it can complement it. And it is oftentimes a cheaper one. Let's say you want to make a replica of a certain armor. You did all the measurements, you make this in metal. It took you, let's say, 200 hours to make, and you discovered that one of your measurements was wrong and you need to remake it. Digital one is just a matter of minutes. The physical one implies a lot. So I think the digital experimental archaeology, and I don't know if that's actually a thing, but I think there's a future there and a lot of possibilities. And I am aware of the limitations of digital worlds, and you always and cannot replace it with the physical world. But you can cut down certain costs tremendously by combining this. So we had an experiment with the replica of one mail code from Denmark that I just mentioned that has a lot of holes and a lot of loss. And of course, in archaeological artifacts, you cannot just say, I want to see how it fits, so let's put it on. Although archaeologists and historians in the past would have done this, but modern archaeologists don't do this. So what we did there was all the losses of rings, and I don't remember how many. I think it was about 2,000 rings that we put again digitally into that weave, and we could see how the garment behaved on a person. How long is it? How much room do you have? Do you have room for another garment underneath for padding, for example? Those things are far cheaper to do in a digital environment than asking someone to do a true copy of all the rings and do this in the Vimose code of mail. We're talking about 20,000 rings. That is not a lot. It's not a lot. Can be way higher. Can be the Romans were absolutely crazy. They go into rings of a diameter of just over 3 millimeter, and we're talking about 350,000 rings. So,
wow.
Digital reconstructions are then easier than physical reconstructions.
It's really interesting because, again, we're talking about mass production, about equipping an army of infantry soldiers. It's not a status symbol, at least as far as we can tell. And yet you're describing objects that are super refined in terms of their manufacturing. So what does that make you think? Like, is there a disconnect somewhere there? Is there something we're missing?
There's definitely an interesting point in that we see that the ring size of mail goes almost hand in hand with the Roman economy. But I would say one of the dangers we have with applying our modern ideas to the past is that we extrapolate what we know. And what we know is that labor is very expensive in the modern world. Materials are cheap or fairly cheap. You want a kilo of iron, almost anyone can buy it. You want a craftsman that works 40 hours for you, that's expensive. This is not necessarily the way in the past, especially not in a society where slave labor, laws around child labor were no issue at all. And you have the entire army as a labor force for you as well. So the arguments that we're used to, like, okay, that is a lot of labor, so it must be very exclusive, does not apply to the same extent to the past or to another society. And I
Yeah.
would say time was less expensive then than it is now. I cannot put a number on it, but it's less. And materials were more expensive. So that kilo of iron would represent a much larger amount of money than to a modern person. And still, it is amazing that these rings are so bloody small.
Yeah.
There's so many of them, and so many people were using them, which again shows the industrial scale of armor use at the time.
Yeah, what you say about the difference in mindset reminds me a lot of what you hear sometimes in certain pseudo-archaeology environments where there's the claim of, oh, we wouldn't be able to make certain structures today because, yeah, of course, nobody today is investing in building a gigantic wall. Like,
I know
but
some people.
yeah, probably. But yeah, you kind of, yeah, you're right. You do need to look at that through the lenses of different economy, but also different values, I suppose. And now we were mentioning moving away from rings, but it reminds me of the Roman cavalry face masks, which are also way more elaborate than is needed for any form of equipment. So I suppose they may have even a different use rather than pure equipment. But
So
yeah, there was also
you're touching upon a very interesting point. In German, they're called Paraderüstung. Literally translation would be parade armor. And the idea was coined by German scholars in a period in which you could imagine a modern army parading and showing off. And a modern soldier, their parade armor is, or their parade equipment is different, is nicer than the ones they use in the fields. Archaeology contradicts that modern use of armor. We do not see any evidence that there was a specific armor for parading and a specific armor for the battlefields. And even if you go as close in modern times as to Japan, for example, and you look at the equipment of an average samurai, these were functional armors that were highly elaborate, very decorated, in which a modern Western mindset would say, no one would fight in these. But historically, we know they fought in these. I would say we can make a similar case for the Roman periods. Then again, lots of discussion has been, for example, the face masks. So some of these face masks are fairly thick, especially the earlier ones. And based upon their thickness, many people have said, well, this is probably an exception, or this is probably battle armor. But there are also some that are not thick. And people have said, well, this is probably for the Romans had a sort of tournaments with horse games. So this must have been for ritualized horse games. And we know the army was doing such horse games. And it's a very valid point. In the end, I think as much as you cannot judge another culture or economy, what I was saying, the same applies to an argument of thickness of actual protection. So we know there's historical incidences in which we know that people are using armor or protection that we know from a rational scientific point of view doesn't work. But they still use it. One could even make, and I'm maybe provocating now, is such a case for carrying a cross on your neck or a symbol of protection. Science can say, well, carrying a cross will not protect you from a car incident. But still, many people will use a cross. I'm thinking about Mexican bus drivers that will have a cross hanging from their car. And you're from Italy, probably there's people also with... So you can say from a scientific perspective, it doesn't protect you. But that is not the only perspective out there. So yeah, we can objectively say that some material is thinner, that it might not protect you. But I don't see this as a conclusive evidence that you can say it was not used in battle.
Yeah, it opens a lot of doors that kind of stay open in a sense.
I'm sorry, no solid
No,
answers.
no, I think we need open doors. Otherwise, it would be the end of the discipline, right?
Yeah.
End of the fun.
Yeah.
When you mentioned the reconstruction to kind of determine room for different layers and everything, were you able to understand something? Were you able, like, do we have insights on how this mail would have been worn over what?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in this case, we wanted to know several things. We wanted to know how it looks fairly long, this mail coat, and it has short sleeves, but we didn't know how short or how long. Because I already told you that the weave can stretch a bit in certain directions. Yes. So if I put it onto a mannequin that is really small, it will look smaller than on a very big mannequin. And the idea was, well, how did this armor look like originally without all these holes and tears? And the only thing you can do to make it visible is repair it, either physically or a replica or digitally. So we were able to first fill in those holes and see actually how does it dress on a person. We were able to see it on different mannequins or in different human shapes. We were able, and this was quite an interesting thing that my colleagues did in this research, is instead of usually the recreation in digital worlds of mail armor is as a sheets of but they don't consider the individual rings. So in the case of Wijnhoven, we have 20,000 rings, and they were able to program it as such that every ring would have gravity movements. So we had all the physical attributes there to see how it behaved. And it became very clear that it was a fairly light coat of mail, fairly open, and that meant that it could stretch a long way. It could fit easily a very thick person and padding, etc. And we would make a comparison with mail armor from different periods. So, for example, we looked into late Iron Age and Roman armor that was contemporary. So the one from Wijnhoven is, let's say, more or less 2nd century AD, possibly early 3rd century AD. And that comes from what is called the Barbaricum, the area outside of the Roman Empire. At the same time, we see Roman armor, mail armor. And you would say this is the same tradition. No. We could see that Roman armor did not have mail armor. They didn't permit so much stretch. So it was a heavier, medium heavy mail armor. Iron Age, late Iron Age, we see very heavy armor. So we see that the mail rings are very thick. They're small, interconnected. So you get a really not so much stretchy textile, but much more a solid thing. So we were able to see different cultural trends. And one of the things that amazed me a lot was my initial thoughts about the Barbaricum and the Roman Empire would be that the Roman Empire would have far superior mail armor. That was my weird. And seeing lots of those in real life and examining them, Roman armor, if it worked, it worked. If it was ugly, it was ugly. So many of the rings, I would say a modern mail maker would cut them out and put a new link there and make it pretty.
Okay.
And Roman mail armor, and I would say Roman armor in general, whether it's helmets or other parts, have all the signs of mass production. Of is it in the center, this hole? It's good enough in the center. Everything that irritates a modern mind that is very much used to now we get to the Barbaricum. My expectation would be, no, it's lower quality, but actually you're looking at weaponry that is of the top tier of society.
Yeah.
And top tier society level of equipment has far more eye for detail. So all the rings are perfectly shaped. They're nicely riveted. So it was, instead of me expecting the Roman material to be superior, no, it was the Roman mass production versus the elite production that we see in the Barbaricum.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And in terms of the like the weight, let's say, of the different males, now you mentioned one is more open and light versus like the really heavy Iron Age one. Can you extrapolate anything about their function in terms of against what kind of weapon they would have been used through this, or is it just cultural differences?
Well, you can say something about it, but you cannot say something about it in isolation. So you always, it makes sense if you see the rest of the equipment, the enemies they were facing, the terrain, the time periods. So if you get into the entire context, it does make a lot of sense. I think one of the reasons why mail armor is basically, it's an Iron Age technology that is still used in gloves for butchers nowadays.
Yeah.
No? So we're talking Iron Age technology that is still relevant today.
And I think the German police still have some mail against like cuts. Yeah. So.
So I would say the reason that it survived is because it's so flexible, not in also in a literal sense, but also in, it can have long sleeves, it can have short sleeves. You can use very thin rings and have it very light and a bit of protection. You can have so this makes it very suitable to adapt it to particular situations. And since it's flexible, you can use it on horseback, you can use it while walking as infantry. And I think that is one of the reasons why it survived so well. And it even continued, of course, next to plate armor. Some areas of the body were just more efficiently protected by mail armor than by plate armor. Although some armors do show, if you want to, you can cover the entire body. But no, that was, I think, why mail was not supplanted. And then when it comes to the weight, I would say a light shirt, 5 kilos, a heavy shirt, 18 kilos.
Wow.
And a light shirt can be just the upper body without any sleeves, and a heavy shirt can be a coif that protects the head, a ventil, long sleeves, integrated gloves, something that goes almost to your ankles. So it can be many different things. Yeah.
That's it's fascinating. So a lot of things that you've been talking about now bring out this kind of holistic approach that you use. So do you have a kind of tips or a methodology in terms of approaching things holistically? Because I feel that talking about arms and armor, lots of times people who are really into it also really get tunnel vision, and it becomes, like I study Napoleonic sabers and the rest of the world doesn't exist. So maybe if anyone is watching, if you have some kind of methodological tips, that could be really cool.
That's a difficult one. Because that would make it sound that I have all the answers, and I don't have all the answers. I can tell you that one of the things I see both in archaeology and in the interests of arms and armor, many people are very preoccupied with typologies and with putting things in the right boxes. So this is type M, no, this is type N. And you can have very elaborate discussions on that. And for me, that is only the beginning. So a typology, or how do you define something, is only a tool to understand the past. And I don't care if you call it M and I call it type O, as long as I understand what the object is. And we can have a clear communication on that. For me, it's interesting to go beyond just what is the type, what is the time periods. And I love crafts, and I love doing crafts. Actually, we're organizing a crafts conference in November in Brno, Crafts in Antiquity. I'm sorry to shamelessly plug this.
No, you should.
It's both academic lectures, academic papers, and half of it will be crafting yourself and making things yourself and showing your craft to other people and learning. But these craft parts I love. And so I love the concept of chaîne opératoire. So the trying to figure out all the small steps that a maker would make to get to the final products. And those small steps oftentimes are embedded within a certain culture. So the decisions the maker makes are not autonomous or not entirely autonomous. And the solutions people choose are also influenced by their environment. So that helps me a lot. But that is what ticks my boxes. I don't know if that will be the same for other people. But just looking at a weapon or just looking at an armor, for me, is a starting point. And it becomes really meaningful if I can understand the cultural context and the making of context and the implications that such a product can have for understanding the past, that I become really excited.
Nice. Well, it's not a universal answer, but I think the more answers like this we have, the more people can bounce their approach off other versions. And so in terms of crafts, are you still very active with mail? Is it something you currently still work on, you build and make?
I still make some mail, but I need to be honest that there have been other crafts that I've been dabbling in a lot. Right now, I'm working on, as I told you, on a monograph on Roman scale armor. So we're making reproductions of Roman scale armor. We're now going to collaborate with a team of people that will go, because scale armor is the small scales are being sewn onto a textile. These textiles are not common textiles, they're particular textiles with properties that suit scale armor, so the defensive properties. And we're now working together with craftspeople from the Czech Republic. And we're starting with the sewing of flax. It will be all the steps until the final product to do together. I have a soft spot for textile studies. But I cannot pretend, I'm not a textile craftsman, but we are going to replicate from harvesting to making the yarn into the weaving and trying to make a replica that really fits. And we'll combine this with our, this is together with a colleague, Maciej Moszek, and I will combine that with the making of the scales itself. So we'll have a replica that is very close to the original. Yeah. And we hope, of course, to learn a lot from those crafts. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I'm also curious what other crafts you're into, by the way.
So one of my main hobbies outside of archaeology is traditional bookbinding. And it goes from sometimes making simple books after a day of work until very ambitious books in which I'm usually never pleased, and I can always see room for improvement. But yeah, I think, at least for me, it's very healthy to combine days of working with my hands with afternoons and nights of working with my hands. I find it very relaxing to do. if all goes well. Um, Most of the time it does. I find it very relaxing to do. And I even find it gives me insights sometimes that I wouldn't have expected. To give you a silly example of bookbinding, how that applied all of a sudden to my studies as an archaeologist. So in the Czech Republic, there is a site, legionary fort, probably legionary fort of Mušov. This comes from the time of the Marco-Monic Wars, and one of the key finds there is a plate that was worn on the top of the chest, would have been one of a pair, and then combined with a scale armor. And that plate has been known for decades right now. And we reevaluated it. We watched and examined it a couple of years ago, and we all of a sudden saw evidence of tin on the surface. But it's a copper alloy, it's a brass. And we saw that this was applied in patterns. And we were very curious, how can you do that? So you can tin an object, but how do you make tin stick to certain parts and not to other parts? So we worked together with Brucker in Germany, in Berlin, and we could do a micro XRF of, and that means basically we make a small measurement of the chemical composition and do that every square millimeter several times. And you can then map it out. And we could see this plate that was really very well known. You all of a sudden, the areas where it had tin, just very clearly you could see. Because chemically, there was still enough remains for this technology to pick this up. And we could clearly see that it was not painted on the tin, but someone masked off areas. And then you have the tinning of the entire piece. So the same Matej, as I already mentioned, has a nice workshop in his place. And we one weekend said, let's do experimental archaeology. Let's see if we can figure out what actually has done this, how this might have been done. And we had two ideas. The first idea was you can corrode the metal locally, and then the tin will not stick to the corrosion. But the uncorroded parts, it will stick, so you have a sort of a masking off. And the other idea was, no, we can apply something, a substance that will all act as a mask, and then you can get rid of the mask. Our money was on the oxidation methods. We said, okay, this is going to be an easy afternoon, easy. Now, first we found out that tinning objects, you need some experience. So we needed an entire day to become not suitable, but acceptable tin. You wouldn't be fired in a tin factory, but here, okay, we were suitable enough. And then we started with the corrosion version. And we found out very early on that it didn't work. One of the problems was, in order for tin to stick to metal, you need some type of flux. That flux is usually acidic because it will keep the metal. But flux affects immediately the oxidized areas. It's made for this. And it doesn't matter a lot if you first put it on and wipe it out. But for this, you need to really wipe. And that technique was discarded completely. And then we got into different options, like, okay, what can you use that the Romans also had? And all of a sudden, I had these thoughts, okay, in bookbinding, we use something called egg glare. And it's the white of egg, and you process it in a certain way, you refine it in a certain way, you apply that to a book, a leather book, and if you want to gilt, it will act as it becomes like a glue, and the gilding will stick to it. So we said, let's try this. So we tried that, and you put it onto the fire to make it like crispy to activate the glue. And afterwards, it worked like a charm. And we just published this research in XArch. It's open access for people that like to look it up. It worked like a charm. That was the bookbinding knowledge all of a sudden being useful. Of course, I need to a disclaimer. This experimental research only shows you how things may have been done.
Mm-hmm.
There might be other options, but this was the option that gave us a result that is very similar to what we're seeing in the archaeological records, and was just by sheer coincidence of having craft knowledge about bookbinding.
Yeah, that's why you need to have people with multiple interests.
That's true. That's true.
And in terms of the tinning, I'm curious, was this like a decorative pattern? Were you able to reconstruct the pattern too, or?
So initially my thoughts was, we know tin is being used in modern day also to prevent metals from corroding, to protect it. So we said, okay, the tinning of armor makes a lot of sense. It's protective. And the interesting thing is we see the Romans never use it as protection. They use it decoratively. So you see, for example, in scale armor, some scales are tin, other not, and you get very nice patterns. Or in this case, this decorative chest plate has already embossing. So it has several figures being embossed. But then you have another layer just by the decoration of the tin showing other elements, geometric elements that repeat or can reinforce what you're seeing. So it's independent and complementary to the embossed image. And this, with the naked eye, can be seen only on the lower part. Enough tinning to say, hey, there's something interesting there. But it was only through micro XRF analysis that it's able to pick up all those different details. And you see all of a sudden it lit up. We were like, whoa, okay, this is cool. Yeah.
Yeah. How long does it take to do a XRF mapping of that kind, like with multiple points?
I'm not the expert, but I have enough experience right now to tell you can do it. Depends on the resolution and the size of the object. If you want a very high resolution, it can take up to 12 hours or longer. But what we've done so far, because in the meantime my institute was able to acquire one of the same machines that we use for this research. So we have that now in-house for our research. And usually if you think something is promising in the mapping, you can do a very low resolution mapping first as a reconnaissance to know, is there something there? And if there's something that is interesting enough, you program the machine, and usually people will leave it at night. So it takes so many hours. So before they leave work, they put it on, and then the next day the scan will be there. Yeah.
Well, that's not bad. Yeah. At least you don't have to be there. When you talk about scale armor, what's the relationship between, let's say, Roman scale armor and mail? Did they coexist? Were they part of like multi-technique armor, or did one substitute the other?
No, we don't see any evidence for substitution. What we do see is that I'm sorry, that in the late Roman Republic, or middle late, we see the adoption of mail armor. So I said the exact point in time we don't know. 3rd century, 2nd century for sure. BC, we see them adopting mail armor. And basically, the army of Caesar, like in the Gallic Wars, for example, is body armor is mail armor. It's the type of armor that they're using. But slowly things are complemented. So we see under Augustus, so around, I would say, 15 BC, a new type of armor is being introduced, being called the lorica segmentata. It's an invented Latin name, so we don't know how the Romans called it, but there's this invented Roman name, and this is the typical armor you will see in cartoons like Asterix, which is ironically because it's set in the time of Caesar, just before they had this type of armor. But so you see this complementing it, although the lorica segmentata is mainly associated with the legionary. So the Roman army would have, to say broadly, legionaries would have been Roman citizens and auxiliaries non-Roman troops. And it was the Roman civilians or Roman citizens that primarily used the lorica segmentata. And then the evidence for scale armor and the introduction amongst the Romans is difficult. We have evidence from the late Republic that they absolutely knew of the concepts of scale armor. We have images of it. And we know that scale armor is Bronze Age technology. So it has been around for years, but not being used in Europe or in the parts where the Roman Empire is at that point in time. The solid archaeological evidence we see just prior to the invasion of Britain. So in let's say the 40s AD, when we see the first solid evidence, archaeological evidence of this. And then becomes the question, was this technology adopted around that time? And was it known culturally as neighbors of the Romans were using it? Or were the Romans already using it, but on such a limited scale, maybe for certain positions in the army, or I don't know, that archaeologically we don't have a lot of evidence, or we have almost no evidence. And it becomes a regular type of equipment around this year, and we see this complementing. And then when it comes to finds in the archaeological records, we even find hoards in which the three categories of armor are combined. They're not, so they're next to each other. So they're absolutely used next to each other.
Okay, interesting. One last thing about Roman armor we haven't talked about, but I know you've studied some. So you want to talk about gladiator defensive equipment. Do we see some are there some serious differences in the construction, or apart from decoration, let's say, but are they effectively different forms of defense, or?
No, of course, the gladiator armor, we're relying very heavily upon the finds from Pompeii. When it comes to helmets, it's not 100%. We have some other finds, but almost all gladiator equipment that we have, with few exceptions, are from Pompeii, are from one specific site and one specific point in time. Of course, we have a lot of images all over, and there are some other finds. If we compare these with the regular Roman soldier armor, there are huge differences. I would say first, you already mentioned the decoration. The decoration is a very, very loud, I would say. And it needs to be in an arena. It needs to be loud. But what we also see is, and I don't have exact numbers for you, is that the weight of gladiatorial equipment far exceeds that of a Roman soldier. Of course, the gladiator, the only thing he will do in his equipment is fight. The soldier will do fighting in his equipment, but he will do also marching in his equipment and all other activities. So you get this balance again of how much protection and how much of the other. So gladiatorial equipment is far sturdier, is far heavier, is far more decorated, and even the themes that we see are slightly different. We see when it comes to gods, we see Minerva and Jupiter being very prevalent, and Hercules very prevalent on decorated military equipment, and less, not saying that they're absent, but less so on gladiatorial equipment. But the two do influence each other. And in one of those cases, we know from, not from archaeological evidence, but from iconography, that we have images from the late Roman Empire, late Roman Republic, in which scale armor is being used by gladiators. Of course, it can be just an image of they're using armor. Not always you can take things very literal. And we have, for example, so I talked briefly about the lorica segmentata. There's a complementary armor for the arm called a manica. And it also consists of limbs. And the first evidence we have, again, iconography, is in the realm of gladiator gear. And then we see it in the military equipment. So I would say they're two different realms, but they are not completely separate. There is a dialogue there.
Very interesting. Thank you. So I think, by the way, we haven't yet mentioned, for who hasn't yet, all of the things, well, not all, I guess there's more, but a lot of the things Martijn is mentioning now are in his book, European Mail Armour, which, though, goes from, you mentioned Iron Age, Roman period to early Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So I feel like, well, actually, before we go into that, make sure if you're interested in getting it, it's going to be released in a paperback edition, which is really accessible. So make sure you check it out.
The 1st of December. And if
Yes.
you buy it on the website of Routledge, right now they're offering 20% off still because of Black Friday and free international shipments. So that might be interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's shameless plug.
No, you need it. And so far we've talked about the Iron Age part, we've talked about the Roman part. What do we see, what changes, or what impact or what effects do we see in early Middle Ages mail armor instead? What are the changes or the...
So I looked both at the cultural dimension as the crafts dimension. When it comes to the cultural dimension, you see again the Roman Empire was this mass production of armor, and that ceases at least in the parts where the Western Roman Empire was. Eastern Roman Empire continues, as Byzantium, but we see a big change there, cultural shifts. Again, a mail armor or armor in general, helmets, etc., are present, but it caters to the warrior elites. It's the richest layer of society that associates itself with warfare, where we find these products, usually marvelously made, wonderful products, wonderful craftsmanship. So that is one of the big changes we see. The other one that is fairly interesting is if you look at the craft itself, there are very small clues if you systematically look at mail armor in which you are able to tell the age of a ring, because certain characteristics, certain tools were used in a certain period, but not in another period. And one of those features that is typical for Roman is that the overlap of that riveted ring is clockwise located. So it goes in the clockwise direction. Well, all modern mail is anti-clockwise. And that moment of change lies in the 5th century. And my first expectation would be, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and of course it's not such a dramatic fall as history traditionally presented, but with the change into a new type of society, my initial expectations was we see one tradition being replaced by another. And that is not the case. We see lots of the features from the late Roman Empire continuing into the early Middle Ages. But one of the key elements that does change is this direction. And it took me a long time of figuring out why is this direction so consistently the same in certain time periods. Because it's weird. There's no advantage doing it clockwise or counterclockwise. It makes the same type of armor. Why would the entire Roman period people do clockwise and then entire medieval period counterclockwise? And the only reason that I can fathom is once I started making mail in groups of people. If people are used to counterclockwise, make a couple of clockwise rings, see the reactions you will get. It's very frustrating. If every ring is in the same clockwise or counterclockwise way, and if you have other people making your rings, it's very easy to weave them in because you already know how they're open and the angle, so you don't even need your eyes. But if every ring is different, each time you need to calibrate your brain, adapt, and close. And that makes it for damn sure that a mail maker, a craftsman, would say to his pupils, I want everything in the same direction, and the direction we always do and everyone does is this.
Yeah.
And it has to do with crafts traditions. You have a proper way to do things and an improper way. And if you do the improper way, it's more impractical. Well, in the Iron Age, interestingly enough, when this technology is being developed, you see both traditions. So it's more craftsman personal. Like in this workshop, we do it clockwise. And in that isn't something we see in the early Middle Ages. So the direction changes. So there's definitely some new wind blowing there. But the rest of the chain operatoire remains the same, and the characteristics of a 6th century mail ring, besides the direction being different, is exactly the same as 5th century or 4th century. So that is very interesting.
Yeah. And in terms of material remains, do we have a good amount, or is not much?
As an archaeologist, we never have enough.
Yeah.
But no, compared to, so the early Middle Ages compared to the Roman periods is, again, we find not a lot, but some. And we go basically, and we need to figure out what is the reason why things are in the archaeological records. In Roman period, the majority of things that we find when it comes to this military equipment, especially from the Principate, the period where we have lots of finds, are from these military places being abandoned, and then usually it's recycling material that we find. There are other contexts, but that is one of the main contributions. The main contributions of finds of mail armor in the early medieval period comes from a funerary context. That is because people got a piece of mail in their tomb and were laid to rest with this. A very interesting tradition is, and this is already present during the Roman period, but it explodes during the early medieval times, is the use of putting mail or other types of armor, can be also laminar armor, for example, in the tomb of a woman or a child.
Okay.
And what we see is that there's two types of burials. We see the high status, very warrior-like burials when you have lots of weaponry, including a complete coat of mail. And if gender has been determined biologically, then it's usually a male. And we find smaller pieces, patches, or a single lame of a lamellar armor, being deposited in burials of female and particularly of children. And the status level is the complete coat of mail is usually there's gold, there's silver, it's very abundant burials. And when you find this in female or children graves is very mid status. And it's interesting because this means that this small piece of armor had a meaning. And that meaning, I would argue, is also symbolic in a certain sense. And the interpretation is, of course, difficult. We can use anthropology to give us an array of different explanations. It could be something small to represent the whole. It could be an amulet to protect you in life. It can be something to protect you in the afterworld. But definitely, it's not only this functional piece of armor. It's also a piece of something that protects you, probably. So,
that is really interesting.
And this is already present in 2nd century AD in the Barbaricum, but especially in the early Middle Ages, it becomes really popular.
And what's its geographical, like, do you see a spread in terms of this tradition, or is it localized more or less to?
No, it's not so very localized. So in Roman periods, I can see it because I've mainly looked at Europe and a little bit beyond. But I, for example, am not too familiar with Russian archaeology. But I know a lot has been found over there. I know for certain that we have a male-using tradition for female graves and children graves there during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century in Siberia, for example. Combined also with jewelry. Sometimes they were used to attach to brooches, sometimes used in headdresses as well. So we have a fairly large spread, the northwestern Barbaricum, and at least a lot of Russia, in which there's still a lot of research lacking, or at least lacking in my knowledge. And we see in the early Middle Ages that the explosion is mostly in Hungary, where it's very popular, but we also see it associated with the Franks, for example.
Okay, wow, that's pretty vast.
It's all pretty vast, but again, it shows you that also in the early Middle Ages, there is a lot of communication and a lot of cultural influence from one place to another.
This was very, very interesting. In terms of current projects, you mentioned some. Is there anything else you're working on, or stuff that you can, or?
No, next year will be mostly a year of writing a lot. So I'm finishing up the book I mentioned about scale armor. I'm editing a book on that is a bundle of lectures that we're giving at the Roman Military Equipment Conference. There's several articles in the mag on all types of armor. And afterwards, I would love to do something bigger than this. I have not I have not yet decided. One of my students is working on the Lorica segmentata, is probably starting his PhD early next year. So I hope we can guide him towards a very nice new study, a new book on the Lorica segmentata. So I would say there's lots in the air.
Nice. Sounds really good. Okay, so I'll open just for the last few minutes if anyone has questions, although I think you've covered things really extensively. So, but if anyone has questions, this is your time to ask them. I just wanted to ask you one question. Since you come from this very kind of holistic perspective, and it's not just the data, and what do you feel is your mission as an archaeologist? Like, how does everything you do find meaning, let's say?
That's a difficult one. I would say as I like archaeology because I like the crafts and the physical aspects. But I'm interested in the past. I will use any type of information that is relevant for me to understand the past. So I will, of course, look at images. I will, of course, look at written sources. I will do experimental stuff. We're using all types of technology to understand it. But in the end, it just has to do for me with trying to understand the past, and through understanding the past, making sense of why things are the way they are. And I think you had also the opportunity to live in another country. I've lived now in several different countries, and the added value to your life is that you can see life through a different perspective.
Absolutely.
And that is very enriching. And I would say archaeology does the same. It allows you to see life through a different perspective. And that makes you a happier person with some things that are very normal to others. I mean, if you want hot water, you will have hot water. Me too. I mean, that's a marvel, I would say. So I would say that is not the task of archaeology, but that is how I employ archaeology in my life. It gives us a different perspective, and that is very enriching.
And do you see, in terms of a trend, do you see more people kind of joining in or being interested in archaeology, or do you see it more as a declining? No, I don't. Declining sounds
No,
really bad, but
no, I think archaeology is always attractive to some people. When I tell people I'm an archaeologist, I get either boring or fantastic. I always wanted to do that.
yeah,
I think archaeology is not a common job. It's not an easy job, but it is a bloody interesting job. And I think there will be people interested doing this work also in the future. And sometimes, yes, there are trends. Some years, some more students. Some years, some less students. And also within the research area. I mean, I think the study of arms and armor in some periods in time, in some cultures, have been very, very much applauded, while in other cultures and other times have been considered completely irrelevant. Why would you study weapons, conflicts? And I feel, although it's not a nice reason, but the modern troubles in the world also make people reflect again differently upon the need to study and understand human behavior and conflict in different times and in different cultural situations. So I think the relevance is being highlighted by modern affairs.
that sounds very true, I think. Okay, Martijn, this was, well, first I want to remind everyone again, if you want to check it out, Martijn's book, European Mail Armour, Ringed Battle Shirts from the Iron Age, Roman period, and early Middle Ages. I'll add the link down in the description. So if any of you are on time, even for the special offer, you even get a discount. Well, thank you for your time. It was really, really, really interesting. And of course, you're welcome any other time you have other things you want to talk about.
Thank you, Gabriele. You're very welcome. And it was a very nice experience to be here on YouTube, and thanking for being so reassuring and arranging everything.
Glad you enjoyed it. Well, we have some compliments also from viewers, so thank you very much. And see you in the next episode, and have a nice rest of your year. And good luck with the workshop in November.
Thank you very much. You guys take care.
Bye.
Bye.